Picture this: you're standing on the sun-baked battlements of an ancient city, the air thick with tension as dust clouds rise in the distance. An enemy force, thousands strong, marches toward you, their weapons glinting in the sunlight. The fate of your home, your family, and everything you've built hangs in the balance. But here's the thing: you're not defenseless. Behind these walls lies a web of secrets, ingenious tricks, hidden traps, and brilliant strategies designed to turn the tide against impossible odds. This is the story of how ancient cities didn't just endure sieges, they outsmarted them. Across centuries, from the deserts of Mesopotamia to the cliffs of Masada, civilizations faced threats that would make even the bravest shudder. Yet time and again, they survived not just through brute strength, but through sheer creativity. Imagine tunnels snaking beneath enemy camps to steal their supplies, walls designed to crumble in just the right way to trap invaders, or even the chilling use of psychological warfare to break an army's spirit before the first arrow was loosed. These weren't just acts of desperation, they were masterstrokes of engineering, tactics, and human ingenuity. Today, we're unraveling 24 of these incredible defense mechanisms, each one a testament to the resourcefulness of our ancestors. You'll discover how cities thrived under pressure, adapting in ways that still leave historians and military experts in awe. Some of these strategies are so clever, they'd feel at home in a modern spy thriller. Others are so bold, they defy belief, but every single one changed the course of history. So join me as we step into the shadows of these ancient walls, where every stone has a story, and every trick could mean the difference between survival and oblivion. The battle for survival begins now. The walls of Babylon weren't just barriers, they were psychological weapons, standing taller than a 5-story building and wide enough to fit 2 chariots racing side by side. These fortifications sent a clear message to any approaching army: you do not belong here. But what made them truly remarkable wasn't just their size, it was their construction. Layer upon layer of kiln-fired bricks, bound together with bitumen, a natural tar so durable it kept the walls intact for centuries. While other cities relied on crude stone or packed earth, Babylon's engineers crafted something closer to an ancient skyscraper, nearly indestructible and impervious to the siege tactics of the time. Enemy forces would arrive, confident their battering rams could splinter the gates or their sappers could tunnel beneath, only to find their efforts useless. The baked bricks shattered rams on impact, while the bitumen repelled moisture, preventing tunnels from collapsing the walls, and if attackers somehow scaled the outer defenses, they'd face a deadly surprise: a second, inner wall, just as formidable, turning the space between into a killing ground. Babylon didn't just defend itself, it turned its walls into a trap, funneling invaders into narrow spaces where archers and spearmen could pick them off with ease. But perhaps the most brilliant feature was the sheer intimidation factor. Imagine being a soldier, staring up at those towering defenses, knowing every minute spent trying to breach them meant more time for Babylon's allies to arrive or supplies to run low. Many armies took one look and retreated without a fight. That's the power of engineering, not just to withstand a siege, but to prevent one altogether. Babylon's walls didn't just set the standard, they rewrote the rules, proving that the best defense wasn't just strength, it was making your enemy believe victory was impossible from the start. High atop a barren cliff in the Judean desert, Masada stood as the ultimate stronghold, a fortress seemingly designed to defy nature itself. While enemies below baked under the scorching sun, parched and desperate, the defenders atop the plateau had a secret weapon hidden in plain sight: an engineering marvel that turned rainwater into an endless lifeline. The Romans, masters of siege warfare, expected Masada to fall within weeks. Instead, they watched in frustration as their opponent thrived for years in one of the harshest environments on Earth. The secret: over a dozen massive cisterns, painstakingly carved into the mountain's bedrock, capable of holding nearly 40,000 cubic meters of water, enough to fill 16 Olympic swimming pools. These weren't just storage pits, they were masterpieces of ancient hydraulics. During the brief rainy seasons, a network of channels and dams funneled every precious drop from the cliffside into the reservoirs. The system was so efficient it could capture flash floods, transforming destructive torrents into a steady supply. But the real genius lay in the cistern's placement. Dug deep into the northern slope, they remained shaded and cool, minimizing evaporation. Some were even concealed beneath buildings, invisible to spies or scouts. While attackers rationed water hauled from distant springs, Masada's defenders bathed, cooked, and even cultivated small gardens atop their desert fortress. The psychological impact was devastating. Roman soldiers hauling water uphill under the blistering sun watched as their enemy lived in relative comfort. Every day the siege dragged on, morale crumbled until the Romans resorted to one of history's most audacious siege works, a colossal ramp of earth and timber slowly inching up the cliff face. Even then, when the walls finally fell, they found not starving survivors, but a people who had chosen their own fate rather than surrender. Masada's cisterns did more than quench thirst. They turned a siege into a battle of wills, proving that in warfare, the most powerful weapon isn't always a sword. Sometimes it's simply a cup of water drawn from a well no one knew existed. The Theodosian walls of Constantinople didn't just keep enemies out, they turned the ground itself into a weapon. Picture a vast trench, 20 meters wide and 10 meters deep, its murky waters hiding a forest of sharpened stakes just beneath the surface. This wasn't just a moat, it was a death trap disguised as a puddle. Attackers who tried to wade through would find themselves entangled in spikes, their armor dragging them under, while defenders stationed on the towering inner walls rained down arrows, stones, and the infamous Greek fire, a liquid inferno that burned even on water. What made this system so devastating was its layers. Before reaching the moat, besiegers had to cross an open killing field, exposed to catapults and archers. If they somehow made it to the water's edge, they faced the near-impossible task of bridging the gap under relentless fire. Even if they managed to build makeshift crossings, the stakes and uneven bottom made movement chaotic, turning every step into a potential disaster. And for those who miraculously survived, they'd emerge exhausted, only to face another towering wall, this one studded with fortified towers, each bristling with more defenders. But the real brilliance lay in the moat's adaptability. During peacetime, it served as a canal for transporting goods, blending seamlessly into the city's infrastructure. Yet when threat loomed, gates could be opened to flood it instantly, transforming a quiet waterway into a lethal barrier. Constantinople's engineers understood something modern militaries still study: the best defenses aren't static. They're dynamic, forcing attackers to fight not just soldiers but the very environment. For over 800 years, this system held firm, proof that sometimes the most formidable guardian isn't a sword or a shield, but a well-placed ditch with teeth. Troy's gates were more than just timber and bronze, they were a psychological labyrinth. While the story of the Trojan horse captures imaginations, the real defenses of this legendary city were just as cunning, built to exploit human nature as much as physics. Picture an entranceway barely wide enough for 3 men to walk shoulder to shoulder, its path twisting at sharp angles. What looked like a vulnerable opening was actually a death trap, forcing attackers to abandon formation and enter single file, their shields useless against the walls pressing in on either side. The genius wasn't just in the narrowness, it was in the misdirection. Approaching armies saw gates that appeared inviting, even fragile, compared to the towering walls of Babylon or Constantinople. But once inside, they'd find themselves disoriented, their momentum broken by sudden turns that left them exposed to arrows from hidden slots above. The very act of entering became a test of nerve, as defenders rained down spears from killing galleries unseen from the outside. Even if invaders breached the outer gate, they'd often find themselves funneled into a courtyard with no exit, a slaughter pen disguised as a victory. Archaeologists have uncovered evidence of these designs in the ruins of ancient Troy, where layers of burned debris tell the story of failed assaults. The gates weren't just barriers, they were stage sets for a deadly performance, where every detail from the angle of the walls to the placement of murder holes was choreographed to maximize chaos. While the Trojan horse might be folklore, the truth is almost more impressive. Troy's survival relied not on mythical tricks, but on a profound understanding of how fear and confusion could unravel even the mightiest army. In the end, the city's downfall came not from a failure of its defenses, but from someone knowing them too well, proof that the greatest weakness of any fortress isn't its walls, but the people trusted to guard them. Carthage Harbour didn't just welcome ships, it lured them into a death trap disguised as open water. As Roman galleys rode triumphantly into the circular port, their commanders likely expected chaos among the panicked defenders. Instead, they were met with silence until the sea itself erupted in flames. Hidden beneath the harbor's stone quays lay a network of bronze pipes, their mouths concealed just below the waterline. At a signal, Carthaginian engineers pumped pressurized oil through these channels, igniting it as it hit the surface. In moments, the entire entrance transformed into a churning inferno, trapping entire fleets in a ring of fire with no escape. This wasn't just arson, it was psychological warfare perfected. The Romans, masters of naval combat, found their disciplined formations useless against an enemy that weaponized the very element they sailed on. Ships packed too tightly to maneuver became kindling, their crews faced with an impossible choice: burn alive or drown. Even those who avoided direct flames choked on thick, toxic smoke as the oil's additives ensured it clung to everything: wood, sails, skin. Survivors described the horror of watching fire spread across the water's surface like liquid sunlight, chasing ships faster than oars could pull away. What made Carthage's system so devastating was its simplicity. The pipes required no advanced mechanics, just gravity-fed reservoirs of oil and teams of slaves to pump them. Yet the effect was so demoralizing that Roman admirals began refusing to enter the harbor altogether, opting for costly blockades instead. For 3 grueling years, this single innovation stretched a doomed city's defiance, proving that desperation could birth brilliance. When Carthage finally fell, the Romans were so shaken by the harbor's defenses that they dismantled every pipe, ensuring no one could ever turn their own naval supremacy against them. The lesson was clear: sometimes the most fearsome weapon isn't a fleet, it's the audacity to set the sea on fire. Deep beneath the windswept plains of Cappadocia, where invaders saw only empty streets and abandoned homes, an entire civilization thrived in the shadows. Derinkuyu wasn't just a city, it was an elaborate illusion, its true strength hidden below ground in a labyrinth stretching 18 stories deep. Picture this as enemy forces stormed the surface, confident of an easy victory. Heavy stone doors silently rolled shut behind them, sealing off staircases and tunnels with a precision that felt almost supernatural. Above ground, the world seemed deserted. Below, thousands carried on their lives as if nothing had happened, baking bread in communal ovens, drawing water from hidden wells, even tending livestock in cavernous stables carved from the soft volcanic rock. What made Derinkuyu's design so extraordinary wasn't just its scale, though with space for 20,000 people, it remains the largest known underground city, but its meticulous engineering. Vertical air shafts, some plunging over 80 meters deep, ensured fresh oxygen circulated even during years-long sieges. Ingenious drainage channels prevented flooding, while carefully placed narrow passages forced invaders to crawl single file if they ever breached the outer defenses, making them easy targets for defenders. The rolling stone doors, each weighing up to half a ton, could be operated from inside with a simple lever system, turning every entrance into an impassable barrier in seconds. But the real psychological warfare lay in the silence. Imagine being an attacking soldier, wandering empty streets for weeks, your supplies dwindling while whispers echoed from grates beneath your feet, laughter, the clang of tools, the scent of cooking food drifting up through hidden vents. No shattered walls to storm, no gates to batter down, just the creeping realization that your enemy had become untouchable. Some armies reportedly starved to death on the surface, never realizing their prey lived comfortably beneath them all along. Derinkuyu didn't just protect its people, it weaponized disappearance, proving that sometimes the most powerful defense is simply refusing to be found. The defenders of Tyre understood something most ancient warlords overlooked. Victory wasn't just about breaking walls, but breaking wills. As Alexander the Great's army massed outside their island fortress, they didn't just stockpile arrows or reinforce gates. They prepared a weapon far more insidious: words. When Macedonian engineers began building a causeway to reach the city, Tyrian archers rained down more than just projectiles. They hurled carefully crafted taunts, mocking the invaders' ancestry, their manhood, even their king's famously short temper. But the real masterstroke came at night, when defenders launched rotting animal carcasses into enemy camps. These weren't random acts of cruelty, they were calculated strikes. The stench of decay mingled with whispered rumors of plague, sowing panic among soldiers already exhausted by months of grueling labor. What made Tyre's approach so devastating was its precision. Their insults weren't generic jeers, they targeted specific cultural taboos of the Macedonians, delivered by multilingual captives who understood the enemy's psychology. A soldier might endure a hail of arrows, but hearing his gods ridiculed in perfect Greek by a fellow countryman, that cut deeper than any blade. The diseased animals, carefully selected for visible symptoms, played on primal fears. Nothing demoralizes an army faster than the suspicion their comrades are dying not from battle, but from some invisible, creeping horror. The effects were catastrophic for Alexander. Mutinies simmered as morale collapsed, forcing him to execute dissenters just to maintain order. At one point, his engineers nearly abandoned the causeway after Tyrian divers surfaced at night, whispering prophecies of doom to sentries. This wasn't just defense, it was theater, with every act designed to erode the enemy's resolve. In the end, Tyre held out for 7 grueling months, far longer than any city of its size should have against history's greatest conqueror. Their walls eventually fell, but their real legacy wasn't stone. It was the blueprint for turning fear itself into a fortress. Centuries later, Roman generals would study Tyre's tactics, proving that sometimes the sharpest weapon isn't forged from metal, but from the raw, terrifying power of the human mind. The defenders of Jerusalem turned cooking oil into one of history's most feared weapons, a scalding rain that transformed siege ladders into instruments of agony. Picture the scene: invaders clambering up wooden rungs, their hands slick with sweat, their eyes fixed on the battlements above. Just as the first soldier reached the top, A torrent of boiling liquid would cascade down the walls, seeping through armor gaps and melting skin on contact. The screams alone were often enough to send entire assault waves fleeing in panic. What made this tactic so effective wasn't just the immediate carnage, it was the lingering horror. Unlike arrows or stones, boiling oil couldn't be blocked by shields. It clung to everything it touched, turning leather straps into burning restraints and metal helmets into ovens. Survivors described the smell of charred flesh hanging thick in the air, a nauseating reminder of the risks of pressing forward. Even those who avoided direct hits faced disaster as the oil-coated ladder rungs, making them impossible to grip. A single cauldron could send dozens of soldiers tumbling backward, their bodies crashing into those below in a domino effect of broken bones and shattered morale. The true brilliance lay in the preparation. Jerusalem's engineers positioned oil vats at strategic intervals along the walls, each kept at a simmer by hidden braziers. When attackers massed below, defenders didn't waste time heating the oil. It was already at the perfect temperature, ready to unleash in seconds. Some historians suggest they even mixed in resin or tar to make the liquid stickier, ensuring it couldn't be easily wiped away. And if the oil supplies ran low, they substituted water heated until it hissed like a geyser, or even sand, superheated until it could scorch through clothing. But perhaps the most devastating impact was psychological. Ancient armies expected battle wounds, cuts, bruises, the occasional arrow. What they couldn't stomach were injuries that felt less like combat and more like torture. The very idea of being boiled alive unsettled even seasoned warriors, making them hesitate at critical moments. Jerusalem's defenders understood something modern militaries still grapple with. In warfare, pain can be a more potent deterrent than death itself. When the Romans finally breached the city in 70 AD, they found cauldrons still warm, a final act of defiance from a people who'd turned their kitchens into armories, proving even the most mundane resource could become a weapon when survival hung in the balance. The defenders of Rhodes played one of the most audacious mind games in siege warfare. They didn't just build walls, they built lies. When Demetrius the Besieger arrived with his army in 304 BC, his engineers grinned at the sight of what appeared to be shoddy construction in the city's outer defenses. Sections of the wall looked hastily repaired, their mortar crumbling, their stones uneven, perfect weak points for battering rams. But as Demetrius's forces cheered their first breach, the collapsing rubble revealed the horrifying truth: they hadn't broken through. They'd been invited in. Beyond the fake walls lay a nightmare of narrow alleys, dead ends, and towering inner barriers. The moment attackers poured through the gaps, Rhodian soldiers triggered hidden counterweights, sending pre-cut sections of the outer wall crashing down behind them, cutting off retreat. Suddenly, an army that had expected open streets found itself squeezed into tight corridors, where every window and rooftop bristled with archers. The kill zones were meticulously designed, angles calculated so defenders could fire from 3 directions at once, while attackers' shields became useless in the chaos. Demetrius's elite troops, trained for open battle, were reduced to stumbling over each other, their formations shattered before a single sword was drawn. What made Rhodes' deception so brilliant was its timing. The city had allowed just enough real damage during previous skirmishes to make the weak spots believable. They'd even left abandoned tools near the fake sections, as if workers had fled mid-repair. But the masterstroke was psychological. Demetrius, nicknamed the Besieger for his relentless tactics, had grown overconfident. His engineers, eager to please, reported the vulnerabilities without questioning why such a wealthy maritime power would neglect its defenses. By the time they realized the trap, it was too late. The inner courtyards where they'd expected to regroup were death traps, their floors littered with caltrops, small, spiked metal devices that crippled charging soldiers. The aftermath was a lesson in humiliation. Demetrius lost nearly a third of his assault force in those first hours, not to heroic resistance but to his own arrogance. Rhodes' engineers had weaponized human nature itself, proving that in siege warfare, the most dangerous weakness isn't in the walls, it's in the mind of the person trying to break them. Centuries later, Byzantine generals would study these tactics, but none ever replicated the sheer audacity of turning an invasion into a staged performance where the enemy unwittingly played the role of victim. For all his siege towers and catapults, Demetrius's greatest adversary wasn't stone or steel. It was the unsettling realization that every assumption he'd made had been carefully planted by his opponents. On the rolling plains of southern Africa, where distances could swallow armies whole, the rulers of Great Zimbabwe crafted a defense system that turned time itself into an ally. Their secret weapon wasn't forged from metal or stone. It was fire, harnessed with such precision that an approaching threat could be tracked like a storm across the horizon. Imagine standing atop one of the kingdom's towering stone citadels as dusk falls, watching distant hilltops flicker to life one by one, each flame painting a map of danger in the night sky. This wasn't just fire, it was a language. Strategically placed watchtowers spanned hundreds of kilometers, each manned by teams trained to interpret the subtle variations in the signals. A single blaze might mean a small raiding party, while two fires set at specific intervals could indicate the direction of a marching column, the most ingenious detail. The system accounted for deception. Enemy scouts might try to mimic the signals, so towers used alternating patterns known only to trusted keepers, much like a cryptographic code. By the time hostile forces reached the outer valleys, Zimbabwe's armies were already mobilized, their supply routes secured, and their civilians evacuated to the labyrinthine safety of the stone city. The speed of this network defied logic. While messengers on foot might take days to traverse the rugged terrain, fire signals relayed warnings in mere hours. Historical accounts describe invaders cresting a ridge only to find fields burned empty, livestock vanished, and defensive trenches dug, all because some distant sentinel had spotted their dust cloud at dawn. The psychological impact was profound. Armies accustomed to surprise attacks found themselves walking into prepared kill zones, their advantage of momentum stripped away. But the true brilliance lay in the system's simplicity. Unlike the colossal walls of Babylon or the hidden cisterns of Masada, Zimbabwe's fires required no advanced engineering, just meticulous coordination and an intimate knowledge of the land. Watchtowers were positioned at precise elevations so each new signal could be seen from multiple directions, creating redundancy. If one tower fell silent, others filled the gap, ensuring the chain remained unbroken. When Portuguese explorers later encountered these networks, they dismissed them as primitive beacons. They missed the sophistication entirely. This was a defense that didn't resist invasion. It outran it, turning information into an impenetrable shield. In an era before radios or telegraphs, great Zimbabwe's rulers achieved something bordering on clairvoyance, proving that sometimes the most powerful fortress isn't made of bricks but of foresight. The Persian Empire didn't just defend its cities, it terrorized invaders before they even reached the walls. Picture the sun glinting off a line of chariots, their wheels fitted with razor-sharp iron blades that spun like the teeth of a monstrous saw. These weren't mere transports, they were the ancient equivalent of a combined harvester set loose on a battlefield. As enemy infantry braced for a siege, Persian commanders unleashed these Scythe chariots in a thunderous charge, turning open plains into slaughterhouses where limbs and morale were severed in equal measure. What made these machines so devastating was their sheer unpredictability. Unlike conventional chariots which relied on archers or spearmen, these vehicles were the weapon themselves. The blades, mounted on rotating axles at wheel height, extended nearly 2 meters outward, creating a whirling radius of death. Horses, armored and trained to ignore the screams, plowed through formations at full gallop, while the blades' downward angle ensured they didn't just slice, they hooked and dragged victims under the wheels. Historical accounts describe the aftermath: fields littered with soldiers who'd tripped trying to dodge, only to have their hamstrings slashed mid-stride, leaving them helpless for the next wave of chariots to finish the grisly work. But the real genius lay in the psychological impact. Persian tacticians often deployed the chariots just as enemy forces began constructing siege towers or unpacking battering rams. The sudden, chaotic assaults forced armies to abandon their preparations and scatter, wasting precious days regrouping. Some besiegers, like Alexander the Great's forces at Gaugamela, resorted to extreme measures, digging hidden pits or planting sharpened stakes in the ground just to stop the chariots from reaching their line. Even when these defenses worked, the mere threat of the blades reshaped entire battle plans, proving that fear could be as effective as any wall. Yet the chariots' brilliance was also their flaw. On rough terrain or against disciplined troops who held formation, they risked becoming useless, their horses vulnerable to arrows, their blades tangled in nets. The Persians knew this, using them not as standalone weapons, but as part of a deadly orchestra. Chariot charges were timed with volleys of arrows to pin enemies in place, while cavalry flanked anyone who tried to outmaneuver the blades. It was warfare as theater, each element designed to amplify the others. By the time attackers finally reached Persepolis's walls, they were often too bloodied and exhausted to mount a proper assault. The Scythe chariots hadn't just defended a city, they'd rewritten the rules of engagement, proving that sometimes the best way to survive a siege was to ensure it never truly began. Centuries later, Roman historians would recount these machines with a mix of awe and dread, a reminder that innovation in war wasn't always about building higher walls, but about ensuring no one dared approach them. In the scorching deserts of ancient Mesopotamia, the city of Hatra faced a brutal paradox. Its greatest asset was also its deadliest weapon. While most besieged cities hoarded water like gold, Hatra's defenders did the unthinkable. They poisoned their own wells. But this wasn't an act of desperation, it was a chillingly calculated trap. As invading armies, already dehydrated from crossing the relentless sands, stumbled upon these seemingly pristine water sources, they gulped down liquid that looked clear but carried a silent killer. Within hours, cramps racked their bodies, fever spiked, and by nightfall, entire regiments lay writhing in agony, too weak to lift a sword. The brilliance lay in the selectivity. Hatra's chemists, likely drawing on centuries of local plant knowledge, laced only certain wells with toxins, leaving others untouched. Defenders drank safely from hidden cisterns while watching enemies slowly unravel. Some poisons induced temporary sickness, draining an army's stamina. Others were lethal, thinning ranks before the first arrow flew. Roman historians describe the horror of soldiers vomiting blood as their comrades fled in panic, convinced the gods had cursed them. What made this tactic so effective was its psychological toll. Armies could march on empty stomachs, but without water, discipline evaporated faster than the desert dew. Even those who avoided the tainted wells faced paralyzing uncertainty. Trust no source, and you perish from thirst. Trust the wrong one, and you die screaming. Hatra's rulers amplified this terror by staging retreats, deliberately abandoning poisoned sites to make them appear safe. By the time invaders realized the ruse, their campaign was already crippled. Yet the real masterstroke was Hatra's ability to repeat the deception. Unlike burned fields or collapsed tunnels, poisoned wells left no visible trace. After each siege, the city simply purified its water supply and waited for the next arrogant conqueror to take the bait. For over 3 centuries, this grim strategy turned the desert itself into an accomplice, proving that in warfare, sometimes the purest-looking resource can be the most murderous. The narrow Sikh gorge leading to Petra wasn't just a pathway, it was a carefully designed death trap where the very rocks overhead could come alive at a moment's notice. Imagine marching through this twisting canyon, walls soaring 200 meters high on either side, your shoulders nearly brushing against the stone as your army snakes forward in single file. Then, without warning, a thunderous crack echoes from above. By the time you look up, it's already too late. A boulder the size of a chariot is hurtling downward, ricocheting off the canyon walls like a pinball of doom before crushing everything in its path. Petra's defenders didn't just rely on brute force, they turned physics into their silent ally. The gorge's natural curvature acted like a funnel, ensuring dislodged boulders couldn't miss the packed ranks below. But the real ingenuity lay in the preparation. Scouts positioned on hidden ledges monitored invaders' progress, waiting until the entire column was fully committed to the narrowest stretches before triggering collapses. Some boulders were pre-cut and balanced on wooden platforms, ready to be tipped with a single rope pull. Others had strategic fractures carved into their bases, allowing defenders to pry them loose with iron crowbars. The effect was apocalyptic. A single well-placed rock could cascade into others, creating a landslide that buried hundreds in seconds. What made this system so terrifying was its invisibility. Unlike boiling oil or flaming arrows, there was no warning hiss or telltale glow, just the sudden, deafening roar of stone in motion. Survivors described the eerie silence that followed each avalanche, broken only by the moans of the maimed and the panicked shouts of those still trapped ahead. And for those who pressed forward, they'd find the path ahead deliberately blocked by fresh rubble, forcing them to clamber over the blood-slicked remains of their comrades while archers picked them off from shadowed crevices. But Petra's true mastery was psychological. The Nabateans who built the city understood that uncertainty could paralyze an army faster than any weapon. Some boulders were rigged to teeter visibly in the wind, their ominous creaks tormenting invaders for hours before defenders chose to release them. Others were left perched indefinitely, turning every stretch of the gorge into a nerve-wracking gauntlet where soldiers flinched at the sound of falling pebbles. By the time attackers reached the city's famed treasury building, if they reached it at all, their morale was often as shattered as their shattered ranks. The Romans learned this lesson brutally when they attempted to sack Petra in 106 AD. Despite their famed discipline, legionnaires broke formation within minutes of entering the sick, their testudos useless against tons of plummeting rock. Those who retreated found their escape route similarly buried, trapping them in a nightmare of their own making. Petra didn't just defend itself, it weaponized the landscape itself, proving that sometimes the most impregnable fortress isn't built by hands, but sculpted by time and patience into something far more deadly. Deep in the dripping shadows of the Teutoburg forest, the trees themselves became silent sentinels in one of history's most devastating ambushes. When 3 Roman legions marched into those tangled woods in 9 AD, they expected to crush a ragtag band of Germanic rebels. Instead, they walked into a nightmare engineered by a man who knew their tactics intimately: Arminius, a Germanic chieftain raised in Rome itself, his master stroke. Turning the legionaries' greatest strength, their disciplined formations, into their deadliest weakness. The forest floor looked deceptively passable at first glance, but every step concealed horrors. Sharpened stakes hardened in fire and dipped in dung to ensure infection, angled upward from hidden pits. Fallen logs, seemingly random, forced tight columns to splinter apart as soldiers tripped into trenches lined with more spikes. The deeper the Romans pressed, the more the terrain conspired against them. Narrow trails funneled them into kill zones where Germanic warriors struck from behind trees, then vanished like ghosts. Even the weather joined the assault as torrential rains turned paths into quagmires, gluing armored boots to the earth while lightly clad tribesmen moved effortlessly through the undergrowth. What made these defenses so effective was their invisibility. Unlike towering walls or moats, the spikes left no trace until they impaled a victim. Roman historians described soldiers collapsing mid-stride, their screams muffled by the dense canopy as comrades stumbled over them, triggering fresh traps. The chaos unraveled centuries of military doctrine. Legionaries couldn't form shield walls in the cramped spaces, their famed testudo formation useless against attacks from above as tribesmen hurled spears from platforms woven into the trees. But the true genius lay in Arminius's understanding of Roman psychology. He'd served alongside these men, knew their reliance on clear orders and open battlefields. By depriving them of both, he turned confidence into terror. When survivors finally breached the forest's edge after 3 days of slaughter, they found not a triumphant enemy army, but empty silence, the ultimate insult to a force that had expected glory. The Teutoburg ambush didn't just kill 20,000 legionaries, it shattered Rome's myth of invincibility, proving that sometimes the most formidable fortress has no walls at all, just patience, creativity, and a willingness to let nature do the killing. When the Roman fleet descended upon Syracuse in 214 BC, their commanders expected to face the usual array of harbor defenses: chains, fire ships, maybe a few catapults. What they hadn't accounted for was the mind of Archimedes, a man who saw physics not as abstract theory, but as a toolkit for turning the Mediterranean itself into a weapon. His masterpiece, a series of monstrous cranes hidden along the city's cliffs, their iron claws dangling innocently over the water until the moment they struck. These weren't just lifting devices, they were siege engines disguised as dockyard equipment. As Roman galleys rode into range, Syracuse's defenders would trigger counterweights, sending the crane's arms swinging seaward with terrifying speed. Giant hooks, each the size of a man, would snag ships by their prows or oars, hoisting them clear out of the water as if the vessels were toys. Then, with a sickening lurch, the cranes would release, sending ships crashing back down, either capsized or shattered against the rocks. Some accounts describe the claws deliberately rotating mid-air, ensuring vessels plunged stern first, their crews flung into the sea like scattered grain. The psychological impact was immediate. Roman sailors, masters of boarding actions and ramming tactics, found themselves helpless against an enemy that could pluck them from the waves without ever stepping aboard. Even more terrifying was the randomness: ships at the rear of the formation might be seized first, leaving those in front to row blindly into a gauntlet of descending shadows. Ancient historians recount the horror of crews abandoning perfectly seaworthy vessels simply because a nearby crane arm had twitched, sparking panic that spread faster than any fire. But Archimedes' brilliance didn't stop there. The cranes were just one piece of a layered defense. Some ships that avoided the claws found themselves skewered by stone throwers, catapults calibrated to drop boulders with pinpoint accuracy, punching through decks from directly above. Others drifted helplessly after hidden underwater beams smashed their oars, a feature modern archaeologists believe functioned like an ancient minefield. The entire system worked in concert, herding invaders into ever tighter spaces where the cranes could operate with maximum efficiency. For 2 years, Syracuse held out against Rome's finest navy, not through brute strength, but through the relentless application of ingenuity. Even when the city finally fell betrayed by a gate left open during festival celebrations, the legend of Archimedes' defenses lived on. Roman generals, usually quick to boast of their conquests, spoke of Syracuse with uneasy respect, as if the ghost of those clanking iron claws still haunted their dreams. The lesson was clear. In warfare, sometimes the most formidable walls aren't made of stone but of imagination, and a willingness to turn the very elements against your enemy. The Mongol horde didn't just conquer cities, they played chess with entire landscapes, moving not just armies but illusions across the board. When scouts from a besieged fortress peered into the distance, they might spot what appeared to be a sprawling encampment, rows of tents, the glow of cookfires, even the distant sound of war drums. But by the time they'd rallied their defenses against this approaching threat, the real Mongol strike force was already scaling their undefended walls from the opposite direction. These decoy camps were more than just misdirection. They were psychological warfare crafted from smoke and shadows. What made the ruse so devastating was its attention to detail. Mongol engineers constructed lifelike dummy horses from stretched hides and wooden frames, positioning them to shimmer convincingly in the heat haze. At night, they'd light controlled fires to mimic the flicker of a bustling camp, while small teams of riders circled just within earshot, kicking up dust and shouting orders to empty air. Some decoys even featured straw dummies dressed in spare armor, propped up along fake perimeter lines to trick distant observers. The goal wasn't just to distract, it was to exhaust. Defenders who prepared for an attack from the wrong direction wasted precious energy reinforcing walls that would never be tested, while their supplies dwindled from constant alerts. The psychological toll was even more crippling. Imagine standing watch for weeks, staring at an enemy camp that never advanced, only to realize too late that the real danger had been creeping through your blind spots all along. Some cities, convinced they were surrounded, surrendered outright rather than face the uncertainty of where or when the Mongols would strike. Others split their forces trying to cover every approach, leaving their actual weak points vulnerable. By the time the deception was revealed, it hardly mattered. The Mongols had already won the battle of nerves, but the true brilliance lay in the system's adaptability. Unlike static defenses like walls or moats, these decoys could be packed up and redeployed overnight. If scouts grew suspicious, the fake camps would vanish, only to reappear miles away, restarting the cycle of paranoia. Some historians believe Genghis Khan's armies used this tactic during the siege of Samarkand, where defenders reportedly abandoned key fortifications to confront a phantom force, only to return and find the gates already smashed. The lesson was clear. The Mongols didn't just outfight their enemies, they outthought them. In an era where most commanders saw warfare as a contest of strength, they treated it as theater, where the most powerful weapon wasn't a sword or a siege engine, but the enemy's own imagination. Their decoy cities left no ruins to excavate, no grand walls to admire, just the unsettling legacy of an empire that could make entire armies question their own eyes. When Cortés and his conquistadors pushed toward the heart of Tenochtitlan, they expected to face primitive weapons, not a storm of smoke that burned worse than any blade. The Aztec defenders had perfected something far more insidious than arrows or spears: toxic clouds of smoke, thick with crushed chili peppers and burning resin, that turned the city's canals and alleyways into suffocating labyrinths. Spanish accounts describe the horror of advancing blindly, their eyes streaming tears, their throats closing as if gripped by invisible hands. Even armored horses panicked, bucking riders into the murky water where waiting warriors dragged them under. The genius of this defense lay in its simplicity. While the Spanish relied on steel and gunpowder, the Aztecs weaponized something as humble as a kitchen staple: chiltepin peppers, some of the hottest known to humankind. Mixed with burning pine tar and packed into clay pots, the concoction created a smoke so potent it could incapacitate an entire platoon in minutes. Defenders, familiar with the effects, wrapped damp cloths around their faces and struck from the haze like phantoms, their obsidian clubs finding easy targets among gasping, disoriented invaders. But the real brilliance was in the delivery. Aztec warriors didn't just burn the peppers, they engineered wind currents. By positioning braziers atop pyramids and along causeways, they funneled the smoke into concentrated waves, herding the Spanish into kill zones where the air was thickest. Some conquistadors, desperate to escape, charged straight into hidden stakes embedded in the lake shallows. Others collapsed from sheer asphyxiation, their advanced muskets useless when they couldn't even see to aim. The psychological toll was even more devastating. For soldiers who prided themselves on technological superiority, being undone by something as lowly as smoke and spices struck at their very identity. Diaries from the campaign reveal a creeping dread, not of Aztec warriors, but of the air itself turning against them. Cortés himself nearly succumbed during one assault, his armor offering no protection as he staggered back, retching, while his men fled in terror. Tenochtitlan's smoke screens did more than defend a city. They exposed the fragility of so-called advanced warfare. Against an enemy that could turn breath into a weapon, even the mightiest empire learned the hard way. Sometimes, survival isn't about having the sharpest steel, but the cleverest use of what grows at your feet. When the Spanish finally breached the city, they found storehouses stacked with peppers, a final, mocking reminder that innovation wears many faces, and not all of them gleam like swords. The Lion Gate of Mycenae loomed over invaders like a stone sentinel, its famous carved beast staring down as if already mourning those foolish enough to challenge its defenses. But what made this entrance truly formidable wasn't just its imposing facade, it was the deadly geometry hidden in plain sight. Unlike traditional gates that opened straight into a city, Mycenae's passage twisted at sharp angles, forcing attackers to squeeze between towering walls that seemed to lean inward, their shadows swallowing daylight whole. Step through that gate, and you'd immediately find yourself trapped in a lethal puzzle. The path zigzagged deliberately, breaking formations into disoriented clusters while defenders rained down spears from hidden slots overhead. These weren't random murder holes, they were positioned at intersecting sightlines, ensuring every inch of the corridor could be targeted from multiple directions simultaneously. Even if you raised your shield against one threat, another would find the gap. The walls themselves became weapons, their surfaces studded with protruding stones designed to deflect arrows unpredictably, sending them ricocheting back into the advancing ranks. But the real nightmare began when invaders thought they'd breached the inner courtyard. Mycenae's architects had designed a series of staggered barriers. What seemed like the main gate was merely the first layer. Beyond it lay a maze of narrower passages, each funneling attackers into smaller, more vulnerable groups. Defenders could retreat behind secondary gates, sealing off sections at will, turning what appeared to be progress into a series of isolated death traps. The psychological toll was as calculated as the architecture. That iconic lion sculpture overhead, it wasn't just decoration. Positioned to catch the setting sun, its eyes seemed to glow as dusk fell, casting an eerie pall over warriors already unnerved by the groans of wounded comrades echoing off the stone. By the time surviving forces reached the citadel's heart, if they ever did, they were often too exhausted and demoralized to fight effectively. What modern visitors see as ruins were once a masterclass in controlled chaos. Mycenae's gates didn't just withstand sieges, they orchestrated them, proving that true defensive genius lies not in blocking an enemy's path, but in carefully choosing where and how they're allowed to bleed. The plains outside Alesia erupted into chaos as the gates swung open, not to unleash warriors, but a thundering tide of panicked cattle, their horns capped with iron and their hides smeared with pitch. Caesar's legions, disciplined against arrows and swords, found themselves facing something far more primal: 2,000 pounds of muscle and terror charging at full speed. This wasn't just a desperate act, it was a calculated gamble by Vercingetorix, the Gallic chieftain, to turn Rome's greatest strength against itself. The brilliance lay in the timing. As Roman engineers tightened their siege works, the Gauls waited for the wind to shift, then set fire to the pitch-coated cattle under cover of darkness. Blinded by smoke and pain, the animals stampeded straight toward the weakest point in Caesar's lines, the partially completed trenches where soldiers were still digging. The effect was catastrophic. Entire cohorts scattered as horns gored through armor, hooves crushed shields, and flaming debris set wooden barricades ablaze. For a few chaotic hours, Rome's famed discipline unraveled, with legionaries trampling each other in the mad scramble to escape. But Vercingetorix's strategy went deeper than mere physical disruption. Those cattle were more than weapons, they were symbols of Gallic livelihood, deliberately chosen to strike at Roman morale. To soldiers far from home, the sight of such valuable beasts sacrificed so ruthlessly sent a chilling message. If the Gauls would destroy their own wealth to win, what wouldn't they do? The psychological shock rippled through the ranks, planting seeds of doubt that lingered long after the last animal fell. Yet the true masterstroke was the diversion. While Roman forces reeled from the stampede, Gallic cavalry launched a simultaneous attack on the opposite side of the camp, exploiting the confusion to break through supply lines. For a moment, the siege's outcome hung in the balance until Caesar himself rallied his troops, proving why history remembers him as a tactical genius. Even so, the cattle charge bought Alesia precious time, allowing the defenders to shore up their own walls and redistribute dwindling food supplies. What makes this moment extraordinary isn't just the spectacle, it's the underlying lesson about warfare's unpredictability. Against an empire that conquered through order and engineering, the Gauls weaponized chaos itself, reminding us that sometimes the most formidable defenses don't come from workshops or arsenals, but from the raw, untamed forces of nature. In the end, Rome prevailed, but not before Alesia's defenders wrote a new chapter in siegecraft, one where the lowliest farm animal could become the deadliest tool on the battlefield. High on the volcanic plateau of Jogovia, the Gauls wielded a weapon so humble it defied belief, yet so lethal it shattered Roman formations with terrifying precision. These weren't swords or spears, but simple slings, the kind shepherds used to ward off wolves. But in the hands of Gallic warriors, they became something far more sinister, the ancient equivalent of sniper rifles, capable of picking off targets at 200 paces with bullets that struck harder than arrows. The ammunition alone was a masterpiece of psychological warfare. Roman soldiers expecting crude stones found themselves pelted with cast-lead projectiles, each molded with chilling inscriptions, some tauntingly marked "catch." Or for Caesar's face, when these bullets connected, they didn't just bruise, they shattered bones, dented helmets, and in at least one grisly account from a Roman medicus, embedded so deeply in skulls they had to be cut out. The Gauls didn't aim randomly, they targeted officers, standard-bearers, and trumpeters, systematically dismantling the chain of command. One well-placed shot could plunge an entire century into chaos as men scrambled blindly without orders. What made Jogovia's slingers so devastating was their terrain advantage. Perched on cliffs overlooking the Roman advance, they rained down fire at impossible angles, their bullets ricocheting off rocks to strike from unexpected directions. Unlike archers, slingers needed no wind to carry their shots, just muscle and physics, launching projectiles at speeds exceeding 100 miles per hour. The distinctive whirring sound of a sling in motion became the stuff of nightmares for legionaries, who dubbed it the bees of death. But the real genius lay in the Gauls' adaptability. When Romans raised their shields overhead in testudo formation, slingers simply adjusted trajectory, arcing bullets to strike the exposed legs. When troops bunched up for protection, they switched to heavier shot designed to punch through multiple ranks. Even Caesar, in his own writings, expressed grudging admiration for their devilish accuracy, recounting how a single bullet felled his senior centurion mid-command, turning an orderly assault into a bloodbath. For all Rome's disciplined formations and siege engines, they had no answer to this reign of lead. The Battle of Jogovia became a testament to asymmetric warfare, proof that sometimes the simplest weapons, wielded with enough skill and ingenuity, can humble even history's greatest military machine. Long after the siege ended, archaeologists would unearth caches of those inscribed bullets, silent witnesses to a defense that didn't just hold a hilltop, but rewrote the rules of engagement with nothing more than leather straps and gravity. The fortress of Harlech didn't just stand by the sea it commanded it. Perched on a rocky outcrop along Wales' storm-battered coast, this medieval stronghold turned the tides themselves into a weapon. While other castles relied on stagnant moats, Harlech's engineers designed something far more dynamic. A network of ditches connected directly to the shoreline, designed to flood with each incoming tide. Attackers who thought they'd timed their assault for low water soon found themselves trapped as the ocean rushed in behind them, transforming dry ground into a swirling death trap in minutes. The system was brutally simple yet devastatingly effective. Channels carved into the bedrock fed seawater into a labyrinth of trenches surrounding the castle's landward approaches. At high tide, these filled rapidly, cutting off retreat and isolating advancing forces on shrinking islands of mud. But the real genius lay in the unpredictability. Tidal surges in this region could vary by over 7 meters, meaning water levels might rise faster than expected, especially during storm seasons. Welsh defenders kept detailed lunar charts, timing sorties to coincide with the flood's peak, when enemy camps near the shore would suddenly find their supplies floating away. Historical accounts describe the terror of English knights during one 14th century siege, their heavy armor becoming an anchor as the tide surged waist-high in under an hour. Those who tried to wade back found the currents too strong, their formations shattered by the very element they'd assumed was neutral. Meanwhile, Harlech's garrison, well versed in the rhythms of their watery ally, launched fire ships downstream, the flames reflecting eerily on the rising waters as panic spread through the stranded invaders. What made this defense so psychologically potent was its seeming indifference. Unlike boiling oil or arrow volleys, the tide didn't hate you, it simply didn't care. There was no enemy to strike back against, no mechanism to sabotage, just the inexorable creep of seawater, indifferent to banners or battle cries. Some besiegers reportedly abandoned the campaign altogether rather than face weeks of watching their progress literally wash away each afternoon. Harlech's legacy endures in Welsh folklore as the Castle of the High Tides, a reminder that the greatest defenses aren't always built. Sometimes they're borrowed from nature itself. While the fortress eventually fell to starvation, not force, its flooded ditches wrote a chilling lesson in medieval warfare: fight men and you might win. Fight the sea and you will always lose. Under the cover of moonless nights, the rugged hills around Numancia came alive with shadows that moved with deadly purpose. While Roman legions slept in their fortified camps, Confident in their overwhelming numbers, Spanish warriors slithered through the darkness like ghosts. These weren't pitched battles, they were surgical strikes, a masterclass in how desperation could birth brilliance. The Numantines, outnumbered and outgunned, turned the very elements Rome relied on, discipline, routine, predictability, into fatal weaknesses. Their tactics were as precise as they were terrifying. Small bands of fighters, their bodies smeared with mud to dampen sound and mask their scent from watchdogs, would infiltrate camp perimeters with nothing but knives and intimate knowledge of the terrain. Targets were carefully chosen, grain stores pierced to spill precious supplies, water skins slit open, and most devastatingly, the leather straps of siege engines quietly severed. By dawn, the Romans would wake to find their catapults limp, their bread moldering in the dirt, and no enemy in sight. The psychological toll was crushing. Soldiers began seeing threats in every rustling bush, their sleep fractured by false alarms, their morale eroding faster than their supplies. But the real genius lay in the Numantines' ability to adapt. When Romans posted extra sentries, the raiders switched tactics, using hollow reeds to blow embers onto thatched roofs, sparking fires that demanded entire units abandon their posts to fight the flames. Other times, they'd mimic animal cries to lure patrols into ambushes or leave deliberately sabotaged weapons just outside camp gates, swords with fractured tangles, shields with weakened handles, knowing desperate legionaries would grab them in the chaos of battle. What made these raids so effective wasn't just the physical damage, but the way they weaponized uncertainty. For every actual attack, there were 3 feints enough to keep the Romans perpetually off balance. Even on quiet nights, the threat alone was enough to exhaust defenders, their nerves frayed by the impossibility of guarding against an enemy that refused to fight on their terms. By the time the Roman commander Scipio Aemilianus arrived to take charge, he found an army that hadn't lost a single major engagement yet was spiritually broken. Numantia's legacy isn't just in its eventual tragic fall, but in the blueprint it left for asymmetric warfare. Centuries later, guerrilla fighters from Vietnam to the Spanish Peninsula would study these night raids, proving that against overwhelming force, sometimes the sharpest weapon isn't a blade, it's the ability to disappear into the dark and strike where the enemy feels safest. The Romans, masters of open battle, never found an answer to shadows that refused to stand and fight. The city of Saguntum faced annihilation not from lack of courage, but from simple mathematics. As Carthaginian mercenaries massed outside their walls in 219 BC, the defenders counted something far more valuable than swords: the debts and desires of the men holding those swords. What followed wasn't a battle, but a masterclass in the oldest warfare tactic of all: the understanding that every soldier has a price, and loyalty fades when gold speaks. Saguntum's leaders didn't just empty their treasury, they weaponized it with precision. Scouts had spent weeks identifying the mercenary captains, learning which ones gambled too heavily, which tribes felt slighted by Carthaginian commanders, even which units had gone unpaid after previous campaigns. When negotiations began, the offers weren't blanket bribes but surgically targeted incentives. A Celtic chieftain received a chest of silver to reconsider his contract. A band of Balearic slingers found their wages mysteriously doubled along with an anonymous gift of fine wine. The message was clear: why die for a foreign general when you could retire rich by simply marching away? The psychological ripple effect was immediate. Mercenaries, already skeptical of Carthage's promises, began questioning orders. Whole contingents misunderstood attack signals, arriving late to formations or claiming their equipment had been lost. Some openly demanded back pay from Carthaginian officers, sparking arguments that fractured discipline. Within days, Hannibal's alliance began unraveling not from enemy action, but from the corrosive power of doubt. Why risk your life for a leader who couldn't even guarantee your wages when a city across the battlefield clearly could? But Saguntum's true genius lay in plausible deniability. No official ever handed coins directly to an enemy. Instead, traders accidentally overpaid for looted goods. Lost supply carts appeared near mercenary camps. Even the timing was calculated. Bribes flowed most freely just before harvest season, when many fighters longed to return home. By the time Carthaginian commanders realized what was happening, their army resembled a leaking sieve, its strength evaporating without a single arrow loosed. The lesson resonated far beyond that siege. For centuries afterward, generals would study Saguntum's playbook, learning that gold could break formations faster than any battering ram. Yet the city's eventual fall, betrayed by a faction that refused to pay further bribes, proved the tactic's double edge. Wealth could delay destruction, but only unity could prevent it. In the end, Saguntum's legacy wasn't just in the battles it avoided, but in the uncomfortable truth it revealed. In warfare, as in life, everything is for sale, even survival. The battlefield fell silent not by surrender, but by divine decree, a sacred pause woven into the very fabric of Greek warfare. When the Olympic flame ignited every 4 years, something extraordinary happened across the war-torn peninsula. Swords stayed sheathed, shields leaned unused against tents, and bitter enemies exchanged nods instead of blows. This wasn't just tradition, it was one of history's most ingenious defense mechanisms disguised as piety. The Olympic truce transformed religious obligation into a tactical lifeline, giving besieged cities something no wall could provide: time. Consider the desperation of a city like Argos in 420 BC. With Spartan forces tightening their noose, the Argives didn't just pray for salvation, they checked the calendar. The approaching games meant 40 days of guaranteed respite, during which Sparta's feared warriors would halt all hostilities or risk divine wrath and social ostracism. That month and a half wasn't merely a breather. It allowed Argos to smuggle in grain through suddenly open roads, repair shattered fortifications under cover of sacred law, and even send envoys to recruit allies from neutral states. The truce didn't just pause the war, it reset the board entirely. The brilliance lay in the system's unbreakable social contract. Violating the truce meant more than military consequences. It brought exile from Panhellenic society, a fate worse than death for Greek city-states whose identities were tied to shared culture. Even Athens and Sparta, locked in their decades-long blood feud, adhered religiously. Messengers called spondophoroi traveled from Olympia to every corner of Greece, their olive leaf crowns rendering them inviolable as they proclaimed the true states. Armies that had been moments from clashing would disengage without a word, the weight of centuries of tradition overpowering even the fiercest hatred. But the truce's true power was psychological. For defenders on the brink, the knowledge that salvation might arrive with the next full moon provided incomparable morale. Ancient accounts describe besieged garrisons shouting Olympic victory announcements across enemy lines, not to taunt, but to remind attackers their window for conquest was closing. Some cities, like Iles, which hosted the games, became virtually untouchable year-round, their association with the sacred event making them politically neutral ground where exiles could plot comebacks and ambassadors could broker deals. Perhaps the most striking example came during the Peloponnesian War, when Sparta halted their annihilation of Plataea specifically to avoid sacrilege. The Plataeans, knowing their city couldn't survive another assault, deliberately stretched negotiations until the truce took effect, then used the breathing room to smuggle out their women and children to safety. What seemed like religious devotion was in reality a masterstroke of strategic timing. The Olympic truce didn't just save cities, it revealed a profound truth about ancient warfare. Even in an era of brutal conquest, some rules proved stronger than steel. For generations of Greeks, the games were more than athletic contests. They were a reminder that survival sometimes required not taller walls or sharper swords, but the wisdom to let gods fight your battles. When the sacred flame burned bright, no army dared cast a shadow upon it, and in that light, even the weakest city found sanctuary. From towering walls that intimidated enemies into retreat, to psychological warfare that turned fear into an invisible fortress, these 24 ancient defense mechanisms reveal something far deeper than military genius. They show humanity at its most resourceful. Imagine the desperation that inspired warriors to set their own harbor aflame, or the foresight that led architects to carve entire cities underground. Each tactic, whether born from engineering brilliance or raw survival instinct, carries lessons that echo far beyond the battlefield. Modern strategists still study the siege of Tyre, where words proved sharper than swords, while architects marvel at Derinkuyu's subterranean labyrinths, where disappearance became the ultimate shield. What's most striking isn't just the diversity of these defenses, but the underlying truth they share. Survival often hinges on rewriting the rules. The Gauls didn't match Rome's discipline. They weaponized chaos with stampeding cattle. The Numantines couldn't overpower legions in open battle, so they turned the night itself into an ally. Even failures like Carthage's tragic last stand reveal the audacity of thinking differently. These weren't just acts of defiance, they were masterclasses in adaptability, proving that innovation thrives when stakes are highest. Yet perhaps the greatest takeaway lies in the psychology of these defenses. From Babylon's walls to Rhodes' deceptive rubble, each tactic exploited more than physical weaknesses. It targeted the human mind. Fear, doubt, exhaustion. These were the real enemies, and ancient defenders wielded them with chilling precision. Modern cybersecurity experts and urban planners alike still grapple with these principles, realizing that the strongest barriers aren't always made of stone, but of perception. So as the dust settles on these ancient battlegrounds, one question lingers. Which of these defenses left you breathless? Was it the sheer scale of Constantinople's moat, or the sinister elegance of Hatra's poisoned wells? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We love geeking out over these ingenious survival stories. And if you're hungry for more deep dives into history's greatest puzzles, hit that subscribe button. Because the past isn't just a collection of dates and battles, it's a testament to the unyielding creativity of people who refuse to surrender, no matter the odds. Their legacy isn't just in ruins or relics, but in the timeless truth that sometimes the best way to win is to rethink what fighting even means.